In my last video, we looked at Osamu Tezuka's first forays into the adult demographic. Of course, this was with the Anime Rama project from his anime studio, Mushi Productions. And last time that we saw Tezuka, things had not gone so well. He had quit his own company after the failure of his film Cleopatra. To hear more about that, go watch last week's video. Do it now. In many ways, the Anime Rama trilogy was ahead of its time, as more mature themes were just starting to emerge in anime. However, in the world of manga, the medium was already quickly maturing. Tezuka's protege, Shotaro Ishinomori, was already experimenting with darker themes and troubled protagonists. By 1968, Gogol 13 had already been pushing many of manga's boundaries. And right around the corner was Go Nagai, with an onslaught of edgy manga. So, seeing this trend on the horizon, Tezuka began to experiment with mature manga, or gekiga. Gekiga, or dramatic pictures, was basically Japan's equivalent term to graphic novels. While you could argue that Tezuka was already trending in this direction in the early 60s, it was during the 70s that he would dive headfirst into the world of gekiga. He would produce some of his most famous and some of his most infamous works. And today we'll be looking at a few of these series, as always selected from our monthly Twitter poll. So if you're bummed out about your series not making it, try harder next time. And without any further delay, let's get things started. Okay, so this one almost didn't get into this video. And if we're being fully transparent, I'm sorry. For full disclosure, I figured that this would have done better in the Twitter poll that I put out, but it didn't. Usually, I only pick the top 2 choices out of the Twitter poll, but for this video, I'm going to make an exception and pick the top 3. It's not like these were really hard set rules anyways. Because multiple people have suggested this series to me, and I figured that if I was going to cover it in any video, I had to cover it in this one. In the end, I'm glad I did. Alabaster is an essential piece of Tezuka manga, despite the fact that it's rarely reprinted. It's the bridge that leads us from Tezuka's hero manga into his darker gekiga. And that's because Alabaster isn't exactly what this video is about. It ran in a shonen magazine and is clearly aimed at a similar audience to Dododo. However, it went far darker than any previous Tezuka manga aimed at the shonen audience had ever gone before. Alabaster is the alias of James Block, a man sent to prison under false pretenses after his girlfriend rejects his proposal because he's black. I'm serious, this is the first chapter, but stay with me. In prison, he becomes friends with a scientist who tells Block about his fantastical invisibility gun. After escaping prison, Block uses this gun on himself to become Alabaster, the man with translucent skin, and he vows to take his revenge on all the beautiful people of society. And to do this, he enlists the unwilling help of the scientist's younger daughter, Ami, born completely invisible. Alabaster is set up like a Tezuka hero story. He has a distinctive look, a power set, and even a special car. You can see some similar elements from Alabaster show up later in Blackjack, both being dark and disfigured protagonists with a younger female sidekick. Though, while Blackjack is somewhat morally ambiguous, Alabaster is a flat-out villain, and that's what makes this manga interesting. It's like an Astro Boy story, told solely from the antagonist's point of view, and without any Astro Boy in it. In fact, the closest analog to Astro would be Rock, a character that most people would recognize from Metropolis, but if you thought he was edgy in that, you haven't seen anything. Here, Rock is a rapist, racist edgelord that fights on the side of the good good guys? The thing is that there are no good guys in Alabaster, at least not really. There's bad guys, and there's even worse guys. And by positioning Alabaster and Ami as two social outcasts striking back at a society that has shunned them, the series ends up avoiding some of the pitfalls that later Tezuka manga would take. As long as you're not taking things too seriously, the manga ends up being one really weird but kind of fun read. The plot goes places you are never expecting, and only becomes more bizarre as it goes along. There are a lot of things influencing Alabaster. Tezuka himself cites Edogawa Rampo, and either indirectly or directly, there is a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe in here as well. The whole thing comes off as this gothic sci-fi mashup, and even in Tezuka's own catalog, there's not too much like it. I would say that there's a dash of Monte Cristo in here, especially in the opening chapter, but maybe that's just my biases showing up again. While I really enjoyed Alabaster, there's at least one person who didn't, and that was Osamu Tezuka himself. As we already know, this was written at a low point in his career, and the darker tone was apparently not well received by his fans. But honestly, I think Tezuka goes too hard on himself. Sure, it ends on a depressing note, but spoiler, so does everything else in this video. He would do edgier stuff in the coming years, so why single out Alabaster specifically? Well, I think it comes back around to what I was talking about before. It might be because it was aimed at his typical shonen audience, and in that sense, Alabaster comes off very immature. And it looks more edgy in comparison because you're juxtaposing the fantastical sci-fi plots and typical manga gags with gratuitous amounts of crime and murder. When he wasn't confined to the shonen label, Tezuka would tackle much more adult topics, without any sci-fi or fantasy elements, and this is most apparent in a series called Ayako. Ayako is a series that I didn't really expect to do so well on this poll, to be completely honest. It's a manga that is brought up a lot, but never really seems to be anyone's favorite, and I think that might have to do with the fact that it's very depressing. The story is not primarily about Ayako, as it is more about the Tenge family. They're a very well-off family with a lot of dark and dirty secrets, and Ayako is one of them. Being the product of incest, Ayako is the source of shame for the whole family. Of course, this is the same family that outright murders each other over inheritance, so there's a lot of bad going on. For most of her life, Ayako is hidden away in the basement. This warps her perception of the world as she grows up, leaving her with the mind of a child in the body of an adult. And that's pretty much the basis of the story without getting into any of the nitty-gritty details. There's simultaneously nothing going on in Ayako and everything. The problem is that it doesn't really seem to be going anywhere for most of it. In fact, you could say that the whole thing is one big long build-up to an aristocrat's joke. But while aimless, I still found it oddly compelling. After all, it's hard not to sympathize with Ayako. And it's very easy to get caught up in the soap opera-y elements that are going on, where you're reading mainly to see plot threads come back and bite people in the ass later on. And for the most part, everything that's set up is reincorporated back into the story fairly well. Tezuka is at the very least following a plan for this story. There's just a lot of fluff that makes it hard to see where the path is at some points. There's a through line of post-World War II history going on that provides a decent backdrop to the story. This shifting time period does have an effect on the plot. Early on, it actually has shades of some sort of political spy thriller. Much later, it practically turns into a Yakuza story. And if I wanted to, I'm pretty sure that I could go into some sort of very specific Japanese social commentary, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for edge. And as far as Ayako goes, it's not the edgiest Tezuka manga. There are plenty of good people in this story that are caught up in bad situations, that end up making worse decisions. In fact, that could really apply to nearly anyone in this plot, except for Ayako herself. She remains pure throughout a whole story that is, ironically, her inadvertent revenge on her own family. but she never means ill will towards anyone. I don't even think she's mentally capable of that. That doesn't mean the rest of the cast is full of angels. The manga has some very dark subject matter. It's definitely got some edge, but in comparison to some other stuff that we're about to talk about, Ayako is a dull blade. So let's leave Ayako with a edge rating of 3.5 out of 5, probably closer to a 4, and move along. MW starts with a kidnapping murderer escaping the police with the help of his gay priest lover, and it only gets edgier from there. Published in 1976, MW probably falls into one of Tezuka's more infamous works, and there's many reasons why. It centers on two characters, the first being Michio Yuki. He plays the role of a wealthy, well-mannered businessman by day, only to be a secret cross-dressing sociopath by night. Aiding and abetting Yuki is his childhood lover, Iwao Garai. He is much more sympathetic, being a Catholic priest that's caught between his guilt over his attraction to Yuki and his desire to save his best friend. Of course, Yuki has more on his mind than his soul. He's trying to get his hands on the secret chemical weapon that turned him insane, the titular MW. Right away, there's a lot of social commentary in this manga. It brings up perceptions of homosexuality in Japan, the role of faith in a person's life, government cover-ups, and a general contempt of corporate culture. But the problem is, MW only brings these up. It's never really developed on. It's the equivalent to a student handing in an amazing thesis statement, only to write complete nonsense for the rest of the paper. The student in question is Yuki, a character that should be tying everything together, but doesn't. Yuki has Batman levels of prep time and ass-pull bullshittery. Where Yuki differs from a character like Alabaster is that Alabaster is a supervillain. He can get away with things that are a lot more fantastical because that's the world that he lives in. Yuki is much more grounded in reality, which strains my suspension of disbelief a lot more. On one hand, it can be pretty entertaining to see him torture his own boss with matches. On the other hand, raping a woman so hard that she falls in love with you is just weird and gross. Yeah, fair warning, there's a decent amount of tasteless rape in this. I would say even more so than Ayako, which managed to have the subject in its story, but not seem like it was fetishizing it. Because MW seems to fetishize Yuki's every single action. The story goes on about how he lacks ideology. Despite having a revenge hit list, he's not going after these people on any moral grounds, it's just because he wants to. And that makes him less interesting to me. Of course, the counterbalance to this is Father Garai. Being a former delinquent turned priest, it seems natural that he should be trying to thwart Yuki, maybe even in some sort of cat and mouse game, but that isn't the case for most of the manga. Garai sees Yuki do unspeakable acts and is horrified by it, but every time he tries to do something, Yuki already had a backup plan to stop him. Or he just ends up sleeping with Yuki. Or he ends up aiding Yuki in murder. See, at a certain point, I stop feeling sympathetic towards Garai, because he's such a passive player in this plot. Always there to admonish Yuki, never actually willing to stop him until the very end. And the manga only touches on the societal implications of their relationship. It doesn't really focus on the perception of homosexuality. Yuki could easily fall into the psychotic transsexual category, a overdone trope. And weirdly enough, I don't think that was the intention, because the counterbalance to this was supposed to be Garai. But with him helping Yuki half the time, the message can sort of just get confused as gays are just like that. But this wasn't Tezuka's intention at all. I think he was trying to create a nuanced take, especially when he has a lesbian publisher save Garai from being blackmailed by his own sexuality. But this message of love in your own way gets lost when the relationship that Garai and Yuki have is clearly toxic, and likely always was. So ultimately, it falls apart on a thematic level. And even on a plot level, things aren't coming together. It really just feels like Tezuka said, fuck it, and made the manga as edgy as he possibly could, because it's built off of shock value. And in that regard, it's still effective today. In fact, if you know the author, then you're more likely to be surprised by the places where the plot goes. It's edgy, and it doesn't really have much more of a point than to be as edgy as possible, which makes it the most edgy thing, giving it an edge rating of 5 out of 5. In Adolf, or Message to Adolf, Tezuka travels down some territory that is a bit tricky to pull off. The Holocaust is a sensitive issue, and it would be an understatement to say that it's not a good look if you treat it lightly. But it's also important to point out that Tezuka is writing about German and Jewish characters from the perspective of Japan, in a primarily Japanese setting, so he really didn't make things easy on himself. So what determines edge here? In this situation, edge means that Adolf has to fumble the ball. It has to treat its subject matter, the Holocaust especially, with a certain kind of irreverence. That's what's going to determine the edge. With that being said, let's look at the plot. Despite what the name might imply, the manga is focusing on the Japanese reporter Sohei Toge, who discovers that his brother has been killed for being a communist. This leads Toge down a rabbit hole of mysteries, ultimately bringing him to the shocking discovery of Hitler's secret heritage. That's right, the Führer is a Jew. As the war expands in scope, so too does our plot begin to encompass these two boys that have a shared name, Adolf Kaufmann and Adolf Camille. Kaufmann is the wealthy son to a German-Japanese couple, while Camille is a poor German-Jewish boy immigrated to Japan. The two Adolfs start out as best friends until Kaufmann is taken away to Germany to join the Hitler Youth, while Camille stays in Japan. As the war goes on, Toge gets tangled up in international espionage, while the boys only get driven further and further apart by their vocations in life. Let me start out by saying this manga is in no way sympathetic towards Nazis. That much was obvious, right? In fact, the most heartbreaking part of Adolf is seeing Lil Kaufmann become warped and transformed into a hateful member of the SS. He's up there in the list of monstrous protagonists in Tezuka manga, sure, but I never found myself hating him, and I think that's because so much of the manga is about his descent into the Nazi ideology, and how he becomes quite literally brainwashed into hating his childhood friend. It's actually terrifying to see these little things pile up until eventually he becomes so indoctrinated that he's able to shoot his best friend's father. And yeah, it's little conveniences like that that could be edgy in a different manga. Things that are clearly only happening so that you can say, wow, that's sad. But I feel like they're earned in Adolf. That's not to say that Adolf is misery porn, because it actually isn't. In fact, it's a lot closer in tone to some of the early chapters of Ayako, being that it sort of takes on this political thriller identity. Toge's storyline is the most separated, but it also has one of the most intriguing parts of Adolf. For these sections where he's the protagonist, the book almost reads like a spy story set in World War II, and I think this was a good choice. It makes the manga shoulder less of the burden that is historical accuracy, and ends up being more exciting approaching things in this way. Ironically, Toge is the part of Adolf that most people cite as a negative, and I think there's two reasons for that. In true Tezuka fashion, it doesn't feel like he completely planned out Toge's role in the story from start to finish. He'll kinda drift in and out of Adolf's plots without you really knowing how it will connect to the rest in the end. But as with the best Tezuka manga, it does tie back together in the end. So I was satisfied with his storyline at the very least. But the second is that Toge is a bit of a ladies' man, which translates to nearly every female character that he meets falling in love with him, to the point where he has 3 romantic love interests at the same time. For me, this bordered too much into James Bond territory. And it actually did take me out of the story at a couple points where I just said, really? Another one? As Tezuka would toss another female body onto Toge. But again, by the end, most of these subplots are resolved before the story reaches its climax, so I can't complain too much because they don't affect the main story all that much. As for Adolf Camille, I don't really have a lot to say about him. Out of our 3 main characters, he probably has the least amount of plot. That's not to say he's without character or without a major role in the story. It's just with him staying in Japan, most of his role becomes about his relationship with Kaufman and how it deteriorates until they are pitted against each other. Now, usually I don't do this, but I want to talk about the ending. So, right up front, please read Adolf if you haven't already. It's a fantastic political mystery thriller manga. But in order to get into its themes, I think it's important that I talk about the very final part of the manga. So, here's your warning, here we go. For the later part of the manga, Kaufman is assigned to find the papers proving that Hitler has Jewish heritage, but by the time that he does that, Hitler has committed suicide. There's no point in covering them up, or even exposing them. Just like that, the papers that he's killed for are absolutely worthless. But the hate that Kaufman has is still there, and so he takes that hate with him to Israel and begins fighting alongside Palestinians, and eventually against Camille and the Israelis. Kaufman eventually baits Camille out into a showdown, which sees Kaufman meet his end. And by extending the conflict past the confines of World War II and the Holocaust, Tezuka turns the story into this sort of cynical tragedy. As long as there is hate still there, the fighting continues until eventually it destroys you. It's a poignant note to end Adolf off on, and it's also a somber note to cap off Tezuka's own career. He would pass away in 1989, and Adolf would be his last long-running manga to be completed. When Tezuka started writing Adolf, he had already passed his edgy phase. He was no longer just trying to shock his audience. He wasn't struggling to stay relevant in a world of manga that was becoming darker and darker. With Adolf, Tezuka had proven that he could tackle dark subject matter in a mature way. And with the manga's conclusion, I think we can say that he ended his career on a high note. That being said, I don't think that Adolf is the type of series that I can slap on a quality or edge rating. If you couldn't tell already, it gets a solid recommendation from me. And this is going to be where we leave off our look at Osamu Tezuka. This was supposed to be a month-long thing, then it turned into 2 videos, released in 2 different months, but I hope you enjoyed this look into Tezuka's experiments in pushing boundaries. From his adult-orientated animated films to his edgy manga, it's clear at the very least that Tezuka was always trying to advance the medium that he worked in. He was, and always will be, the god of manga.